It was a regular Thursday evening in the city, bustling with life as it always was. The streets were lined with tall skyscrapers that reflected the glowing lights from the shops, bars, and restaurants below. At the pinnacle of it all, David Knight stood tall in his high-rise office, overlooking the world he had conquered. The billionaire CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the world, David had it all: wealth, power, success. His life, meticulously curated to show only perfection, was the envy of many. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a secret he kept from everyone: his inexplicable, crippling allergy to physical touch from women. David's condition wasn't just unusual, it was borderline tragic. No one knew the real reason behind it. The most anyone had ever gathered was that it was the result of some psychological trauma from his past. For years, he had managed it, using his wealth to hire the best therapists, but none could ever give him the answers he desperately sought. Still, his condition remained a mystery, one that he hid behind an unshakable mask of confidence. The few people closest to him knew better than to ask too many questions. They had learned over time that some things were simply untouchable. That night, he was hosting one of his company's largest events, a gala that would determine the future of his business. Investors were flying in from all over the world, hoping to get a glimpse of the billionaire who had built his empire from nothing. It was the kind of evening that required the utmost professionalism, the kind of evening where nothing could go wrong. Except, for David, something always did. The moment he stepped onto the stage, everything seemed to blur into the background. The cameras flashed, the lights shone brightly, and the room full of powerful people watched as he made his entrance. Yet something about tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that David couldn't shake off. As he made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, it felt as though the room was closing in on him. His chest tightened. He wiped his forehead, realizing he was sweating more than usual. "Just breathe, David. You've done this 1,000 times, he muttered to himself, trying to calm the rising panic inside him. Then, it happened. He felt it. A slight touch on his arm, soft and unassuming. A woman. It was as though the world stopped for a moment. The touch triggered something deep within him, something primal. His body recoiled, but it wasn't just the touch. It was the wave of panic that surged through him. His vision blurred. His breath became shallow, his throat constricting as if it were closing up. He staggered for a moment, but no one seemed to notice. They were too busy with their conversations, too consumed by their business deals to see the CEO of the company slowly losing control. He fell to the ground, his heart racing as his body fought against the allergic response. The room erupted in chaos, but it felt like the world had slowed down for him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. People rushed to his side, but it was too late to pretend that everything was fine. The truth was out. The CEO who had built an empire, who had seemed invincible, was vulnerable. The doctors arrived moments later, stabilizing him as best as they could, but the damage had already been done. His secret had been exposed to the world. David was rushed to the hospital, and the press had already caught wind of the incident. News outlets scrambled to get a story, but no one truly understood what had happened. The official statement was vague: a medical emergency involving the CEO. But behind closed doors, the executives who had witnessed the collapse were in shock. They had known about David's condition in passing, but no one had ever imagined it could come to this. What had been a hidden weakness was now a glaring problem. David was placed under observation in the hospital, but it wasn't just his health that was in jeopardy. His company was now under scrutiny. Investors were pulling out. People were questioning his ability to lead. Sarah and Mark, who had been by his side for years, were at a loss for what to do. Their loyalty to David had always been unwavering, but this was different. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a crisis of trust. As the hours passed, David lay in the sterile hospital room, alone with his thoughts. His body felt drained, but his mind was racing. He had spent so much of his life hiding this part of himself, creating a world around him where he was untouchable. Now, everything he had worked for seemed to be slipping away. What would happen to his company? What would happen to him? He had been living a lie, and now, the truth was out in the open. But as he lay there, trying to breathe through the panic, one thought echoed in his mind. What if this is the moment that changes everything? What if, for the first time, I confront what I've been running from all my life? It wasn't just an allergic reaction that had brought him to this point. It was something deeper. Something that had haunted him for years. And now, in the quiet of the hospital room, he knew that his life was about to take a drastic turn. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a journey that would not only transform his life but also change the lives of those closest to him. The world may have seen a billionaire CEO lose control in a moment of vulnerability, but what they didn't know was that David Knight was about to face the most profound challenge of his life. And this time, it wasn't a challenge he could ignore. David Knight had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. From the moment he left his small town and set foot in the city with nothing but a dream and a few dollars in his pocket, he had fought tirelessly to build the empire that was now his. He had learned the rules of the game early on and had mastered them. Ambition, discipline, and sheer determination had propelled him to the top. But there was something that no amount of success or wealth could change, a deep, unspoken fear that had taken root in him long before he ever became the billionaire CEO the world now knew. Born to a family with deep ties to a small, tight-knit community, David was always a quiet child, more focused on reading and learning than socializing with the other kids. His parents, well-respected figures in their town, had always tried to push him into the spotlight, to make him just like everyone else. But David felt different, even as a young boy. He never quite fit in. His peers would joke about how he was a bit too sensitive, too withdrawn. But David didn't mind. His world was a world of books, of endless curiosity. He had dreams, big ones, and he nurtured them quietly, away from the noise of the world. It was when he was around 10 years old that something happened, a seemingly innocent moment that would shape his life in ways he could never have predicted. David's family had been invited to a neighbor's party. His parents insisted he go, and though he had no interest in socializing with the other children, he reluctantly agreed. At that party, he met her, his cousin, Linda. She was older than him by a few years, a carefree and vibrant young woman. At first, David was charmed by her easy smile and the way she seemed to effortlessly command the attention of the room. But as the evening wore on, things took a darker turn. Linda, who was much more outgoing than David, took a peculiar interest in him. She would pull him aside in private moments, touch his arm, her hand lingering too long, laugh too loudly when they were alone. David didn't know how to react. Her actions felt off, but he couldn't understand why. It wasn't until much later, after years of therapy and introspection, that David would begin to understand the trauma that had been seeded in that moment, the unsettling touch that had started it all. His parents had noticed his growing discomfort, but they chalked it up to his typical shyness. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that those encounters with Linda had left a scar on David's psyche. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened in his family, but it was the first time David had been so profoundly affected by it. As a child, he didn't have the words to express what was happening inside him. He kept his personal space rigidly defined, always careful not to let anyone cross that invisible line. If he did need to interact with women in business, he maintained an aura of professionalism, never allowing things to get too personal. But the fear remained, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to strike when he least expected it. As his company grew, so did the stakes. David was no longer just a tech mogul, he was a symbol of success, a man who seemed to have it all. He was invited to high-profile events, galas, and fundraisers where his name was spoken with reverence. The world admired his sharp mind and relentless ambition, but few knew the truth about the man behind the carefully curated image. Few knew that David lived with a constant, suffocating anxiety, knowing that at any moment, his allergy could flare up, unraveling the delicate balance he had worked so hard to create. There was one person who knew a little about David's struggle, Sarah. Sarah had been his assistant for nearly 5 years, and over that time, she had come to understand the complexities of David's life. She was sharp, loyal, and perceptive, and though she had never pried into his personal affairs, she couldn't help but notice the signs. She had witnessed David's increasing discomfort around women, how he would stiffen if a female colleague came too close or how he would subtly avoid situations where physical contact was inevitable. At first, she thought it was just his way of being a bit aloof, a side effect of being a successful CEO. But as time went on, she realized that there was something more to it, something that David was hiding, something that he would never, ever talk about. And then there was Mark, David's longtime business partner. Mark was everything David was not: outgoing, charming, and unafraid of putting himself in the spotlight. He had been there from the beginning, building the company alongside David, and though he never fully understood the extent of David's fear, he had always respected his friend's boundaries. Mark never pushed, never asked questions. He knew that David valued his privacy, and he had learned to respect that, even when it meant keeping his distance from the truth. But despite the successful front that David had created, despite the control he had over every aspect of his business, there were moments when his vulnerability crept in. There were moments when he would glance at Sarah or Mark and, for a split second, let his guard down. And in those rare moments, the weight of his secret would feel almost unbearable. But David kept it hidden. He kept it locked away in the deepest corners of his mind, believing that if he just pushed through, if he just kept focusing on his work, he could keep it at bay. No one could ever know. No one could ever find out that the man who had it all, the man who had built an empire from nothing, was terrified of something so simple and yet so profound. But no amount of control, no amount of success, could stop the inevitable. The night of the gala, everything that David had worked so hard to conceal was about to be exposed. The perfect facade he had spent years constructing was about to crumble, and with it, his carefully built world. What David didn't know, as he stood there that night, shaking hands and greeting his investors, was that the true test of his life was about to begin. David's mind raced as he sat in the sterile hospital room, the events of the night replaying over and over in his head. The air felt thick with a sense of inevitability. He had always known that something like this could happen, but he had never truly believed it would. The world that had been so carefully built around him, the walls he had constructed to protect his secret, were now crumbling. His business empire, his reputation, everything he had worked for, everything was at risk. The doctors had assured him that the allergic reaction wasn't life-threatening, but it felt like much more than that. It was as though his entire world had just shifted in a matter of hours. The thought of the media frenzy that was about to unfold was almost too much to bear. In the age of constant news cycles and social media, no secret could stay hidden for long. Already, the rumors had begun to spread. The press was outside the hospital, waiting for any scrap of information. His assistant, Sarah, had warned him earlier that a few reporters had already tried to reach her for comments. The whole thing felt surreal. He had spent his entire career managing perceptions, creating an image of invulnerability. And now, in the blink of an eye, that image was shattered. As the hours passed, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. David had been the picture of health, the embodiment of success. But what good was success if you couldn't trust your own body? What good was wealth if it couldn't buy you freedom from the demons that haunted you? In a twisted way, the allergic reaction was a wake-up call, a cruel reminder that no matter how much money you had or how many accolades you accumulated, there were still things beyond your control. Things that no amount of power could protect you from. Sarah had been by his side ever since he arrived at the hospital. She was, in many ways, his anchor. Over the years, she had seen him at his best and at his worst, but never like this. She had always known that David had his struggles, but she had never guessed how deep they ran. As his assistant, she had been privy to his professional life, but she had always kept a respectful distance from his personal one. However, in the wake of the crisis, the distance between them was quickly evaporating. She could see the cracks in David's armor, and it was breaking her heart. "David, we need to talk," she said gently, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over the room. David turned to her, his face pale. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the concern in her eyes. He had always prided himself on his independence, but right now, he couldn't deny that he was lost. He needed her. "I know, Sarah," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I know we need to talk. But I don't know what to say. I don't know how to explain this. How do I even begin to explain that this allergy is why I've been like this for all these years?" Sarah sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. "You don't have to explain anything, David. I don't need to know the details. What matters is that you're okay. We'll figure this out. You don't have to go through this alone." But David wasn't so sure. How could he explain this to anyone? How could he trust anyone to understand the magnitude of what he was going through? He had spent his entire life hiding from his own truth, and now, it was all crashing down. The thought of the press getting their hands on his personal life was enough to send him into a spiral of anxiety. He could already imagine the headlines: "Billionaire CEO has strange allergy to women," or "The dark secret of tech mogul David Knight." The idea of the world knowing that he had been living with such a vulnerability was terrifying. "Sarah, what if everything changes after this? What if my company falls apart? What if the investors pull out? What if they see me as weak? I can't afford to look weak," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand, trying to offer comfort. "You're not weak, David. You've built something incredible, and that's not going to disappear overnight. People will still respect you for what you've accomplished, but more importantly, they'll respect you for being honest with yourself and with them. This isn't the end. It's just a new chapter." David shook his head. "I don't know if I can handle it. I've spent so much time running away from this. I thought I could keep it hidden forever. But now it's out there. And I don't know how to fix it." The weight of his words hung in the air. Sarah sat in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. She had known David for years, but she had never seen him this vulnerable, this uncertain. It was almost as though the man she had worked for, the man she had admired, had been replaced by someone entirely different, a man who was not just battling an allergy, but a profound fear that had taken over his entire existence. I think it's time for you to stop running, David," she said softly, her voice full of compassion. "You've built an empire on being strong, on never letting anything get in your way. But maybe it's time to let people in." Was a weakness. He had built his entire persona around the idea that a true leader was unbreakable, invincible. But now, in the face of his own limitations, he was beginning to realize that maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. As the night wore on, David found himself reflecting on his past, on the choices he had made, and on the walls he had built around himself. For so long, he had relied on his wealth and success to define him, to protect him from the things he was too afraid to confront. But now, those walls were crumbling. The allergy that had been a secret for so long was no longer something he could control. And as much as he hated to admit it, the reality of his situation was that he had to face it, head on. In the days that followed, David's life was turned upside down. The press had a field day with the story, and before long, the entire world knew about his strange condition. It was a topic of endless speculation and gossip, and every news outlet seemed to have their own take on the situation. But for David, it wasn't about the headlines or the media frenzy. It was about how his life was about to change. He had always been a man of action, a man who thrived in the world of business. But now, the most important challenge he would ever face wasn't one of stocks or deals, it was a challenge of the heart, a challenge of identity. For the first time in his life, David realized that he could no longer run from himself. The life-altering decision that lay before him wasn't one he could ignore. He could either continue to hide in the shadows, allowing his fear to control him, or he could confront it, embrace it, and finally become the man he had always wanted to be, a man who wasn't defined by his allergy, by his past, or by the walls he had built. But as the days passed, it became clear to him that this journey wasn't going to be an easy one. It wasn't just about overcoming the allergy. It was about confronting the pain, the shame, and the fear that had been with him for so long. And as he sat in the quiet of his hospital room, David realized that the true test of his strength wasn't how much he could control, but how much he could let go. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: David Knight was no longer the same man he had been just a few days ago. The old David had been consumed by his fear, his secrets. The new David, the one who would emerge from this crisis, would have to face the world with a kind of bravery he had never known before. David sat in his office the next day, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the desk lamp. The room was eerily quiet, save for the sound of his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his desk. The world outside his windows had not changed, people still hustled, cars still honked, the city still buzzed with life, but for him, it all felt distant. His mind kept replaying the events from the previous night, unable to escape the image of himself, vulnerable, exposed. His body had betrayed him in front of a crowd of investors, partners, and colleagues. A simple handshake had set off a chain reaction that not only threatened his health but also his entire empire. In the span of a few moments, the walls of invincibility he had so carefully constructed had crumbled into dust. He wasn't sure what was worse, the allergic reaction itself or the fact that everyone now knew the secret he had kept hidden for so long. The media had pounced on the story with a hunger that felt insatiable. Headlines screamed about his strange condition, trying to make sense of something that didn't quite fit within the neat, polished image of a self-made billionaire. The ridicule was unbearable. Billionaire CEO allergic to women, one headline mocked. Tech mogul's shocking secret revealed, is this the end of his reign? The questions were endless, and the scrutiny was all-consuming. He had been thrust into the spotlight in a way he never wanted. Every conversation, every interaction with people now felt like a performance. No longer was he just the enigmatic CEO, now, he was the man who couldn't even be in the same room as a woman without breaking into hives. How could he be taken seriously now? David ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. The weight of everything, the company, the media, the mounting pressure to salvage his reputation, was almost too much to bear. His thoughts drifted to Sarah. She had been his rock, the one person who understood him and his silent struggles, even if she hadn't known the full extent of his pain. When he had arrived back at his apartment last night, after the chaos of the hospital and the press frenzy, Sarah had been there, offering her usual quiet support. But even her comforting presence couldn't ease the dread that was steadily building in the pit of his stomach. The path forward was clouded, uncertain, and the idea of facing the public, of speaking out about what had happened, terrified him. But he knew that hiding was no longer an option. He could already feel the pressure building from every side. Investors were demanding answers, and his board was sending constant emails, some laced with concern, others with frustration. Everyone was waiting for him to act, to make it clear that he was still in control. But control had never felt more elusive. The very thing that had made him who he was, the iron grip on every detail of his life, his business, his image, was now slipping through his fingers. In an attempt to regain some semblance of control, David called a meeting with his top executives. His office, once a symbol of success and power, now felt like a battlefield. As each person filed in, David couldn't help but feel a wave of panic. These were people who had stood by him, who had believed in him when no one else had. They had followed his vision and helped him build the company into the powerhouse it was today. But now, it felt as though that vision was slipping away from him. As he looked around the room, David could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Some of them tried to hide it, putting on a professional front, but others were more open about their concern. They had all heard the news. It wasn't just the press that had caught wind of his situation, word had spread through the corporate world like wildfire. Whispers were circulating about his health, his personal life, and, most importantly, his future as the CEO of the company. If David was to save his company, he had to face this head-on, not just with his business acumen, but with something far more vulnerable, his truth. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," David began, his voice sounding more strained than he would have liked. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the weight that seemed to settle on his shoulders. "I know there's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of uncertainty. And I want to address that. I'm not here to make excuses or give you vague reassurances. I'm here to be honest." There was a slight shift in the room, a change in the atmosphere. Everyone seemed to lean in, their attention fully on him. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when the walls he had built around himself would finally crumble for good. But he couldn't hold back anymore. He had to face it, for his company, for his team, and for himself. "I've been hiding something for a long time," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Something that's been a part of my life for longer than I care to admit. I know the media has had a field day with it, but the truth is, I've had an allergy. A rare, and frankly, strange allergy, to physical contact with women. It's something I've learned to live with, but it's been a struggle. A struggle that I've kept hidden from all of you." The room was silent. No one spoke, no one moved. David could feel the weight of their gazes on him, could hear the faint sound of their breaths as they processed his words. It was almost like time had stopped, the world holding its breath as he laid his truth bare. "I know this isn't easy to understand," David said, his gaze moving from one face to the next. "Hell, it's not easy for me to understand. But I've built my life around this, around keeping it hidden, around making sure it never came between me and what I wanted to accomplish. But I realize now that hiding from it, pretending like it wasn't a part of who I am, has only made everything worse. It's affected my relationships, my work, my health, and it's time I stop running from it. It's time I face it head on, and I need your support to do that." He paused, letting his words sink in. He wasn't sure what kind of response he was expecting. Anger? Disappointment? Shock? The truth was, he wasn't sure what he was expecting at all. But he couldn't keep this secret any longer. Not if he was going to move forward. To his surprise, it was Mark who spoke first. Mark, who had been by his side for years, who had seen him through countless business dealings and high-stakes negotiations, was the one who stood up and walked over to David. "David," Mark said, his voice calm, almost reassuring. "This isn't what I expected, but it doesn't change anything. We've all known you to be a man of integrity, of vision. You've led us to this point, and we're still with you. We'll figure this out together." The room seemed to exhale collectively. There were no accusations, no judgment. Just a quiet understanding. As the meeting went on, David could see that his team was rallying around him, not because they pitied him, but because they believed in him. They had seen the real David Knight, the visionary, the relentless worker, the man who had made them part of something great. And that was more important than any flaw, any allergy, any secret. But as the meeting ended and the executives filed out, David felt a strange mix of relief and fear. For the first time in his life, he had let down his guard. He had opened up about something that had always been a source of shame. And yet, in doing so, he had not been met with the rejection he feared most. Instead, he had been met with empathy, with understanding. There was still much to be done. The press would continue to hound him, the board would demand assurances, and the future of his company was uncertain. But in that moment, David realized something profound. His journey was no longer just about building a business or proving himself to the world. It was about building something far more important, his own peace. The kind of peace that came from accepting himself, flaws and all. The kind of peace that allowed him to stand in front of his team and say, "This is me. Take it or leave it." And for the first time in a long time, David was ready to take it. Ready to face the world not as a perfect, invincible CEO, but as a man who had been broken, who had been scared, and who had found the strength to rebuild. David's life had changed irreversibly. The truth that had been kept hidden for years was now out in the open, and though he had no idea what the future held, one thing was certain: he could no longer pretend to be the man he once was. For better or worse, the mask had come off, and the world was seeing him in a way he had always feared. He couldn't stop the whirlwind of media attention, the endless headlines about his allergy, and the seemingly endless questions from investors and the board members. But in the silence of his office, behind the closed doors of his empire, he felt something new, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Vulnerability. And strangely, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like freedom. For the first time in his life, David allowed himself to reflect, not just on his allergy, not just on the scandal and the fallout, but on everything. The choices he had made, the life he had built, the person he had tried so desperately to become. As a young man, he had been driven by a need to prove himself, to show the world that he could be more than what people expected of him. He had worked tirelessly, relentlessly. Every decision, every deal, every late-night work session had been calculated to build his empire, to elevate him above the fears and insecurities that had plagued his early years. But in his pursuit of success, he had neglected the one thing that had always been his Achilles heel, his fear of being vulnerable, his inability to allow himself to be imperfect. The fear of imperfection had kept him isolated for so long. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who admired him, who respected his work ethic and his results, but very few had ever truly known him. He had kept his relationships surface level, never letting anyone in too deep. He had buried the parts of himself that he deemed weak, refusing to acknowledge his flaws because doing so would make him feel small, inadequate. In his world, only strength mattered. Only strength could get him to the top. But now, facing the media frenzy and the looming uncertainty of his future, he realized that it wasn't just his allergy that had been holding him back all these years, it was his inability to connect, his inability to show who he truly was. As the days passed, David began to come to terms with his new reality. The press continued to hound him, but there was a change in the way he handled it. He no longer tried to hide behind carefully crafted statements or evasive answers. Instead, he stood in front of the cameras, calm but direct. He answered questions about his condition with honesty, acknowledging that it was something he had struggled with for years but that it was not something that defined him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he wanted to retreat, to go back into hiding, but the more he spoke, the more he realized that he didn't need to hide anymore. The truth was out there, and it was time for him to stop running from it. In the midst of the media circus, something unexpected happened. His team, his executives, the people who had followed him for years, began to rally around him. They saw something in him that they hadn't before, an authenticity, a humility that had been absent from his persona until now. His openness about his condition, his willingness to face the truth head-on, resonated with them in a way that words alone never could. The respect they had for him shifted. It wasn't just about his business acumen anymore. It was about his courage to confront his own vulnerabilities, to be real, to be human. Meanwhile, Sarah remained by his side, offering quiet support when the pressure became too much. She had always been a steady presence in his life, but now, as they faced the challenges together, she became something more, a partner in his journey of self-discovery. Sarah had always known the man behind the CEO facade, but now, as David shared more of his personal struggles, she could see the weight that had been lifted from his shoulders. For years, he had carried the burden of perfection. But now, in the wake of his confession, he was beginning to accept that perfection was a myth, an illusion. His true strength lay not in his ability to control every aspect of his life, but in his willingness to let go, to allow himself to be seen for who he truly was. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling media session, David found himself alone in his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of expectations. The world was still buzzing around him, but he felt strangely at peace. There was no longer any need to put on a mask. There was no longer any need to pretend. He could let the world see him as he was, a man who had faced his fears and was learning to embrace his flaws. In the weeks that followed, David's company began to stabilize. It wasn't a smooth road, there were moments of doubt, moments when the media tried to capitalize on his vulnerability, and moments when he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of leading the company while still navigating his personal struggles. But the company survived. In fact, it thrived. The investors, who had initially been wary, began to see a different side of David. They saw a man who was not just about business success, but about authenticity and resilience. They saw someone who had faced a personal crisis and come out stronger on the other side. And slowly but surely, they began to trust him again. As for David, he began to rebuild his life in a way that he had never imagined possible. He stopped chasing after perfection and started focusing on what truly mattered, building meaningful connections with the people around him. He reconnected with old friends, people he had neglected for years in his pursuit of success. He spent more time with his family, repairing relationships that had been strained by his single-minded focus on his career. He started to see life not as a race to the top, but as a journey to be shared with others. The friendships he had once neglected began to deepen, and the people who truly cared for him became his support system, his anchors in the storm of his life. David also began to engage in more self-reflection. He sought out therapy, something he had never considered before. Talking to a professional helped him to untangle the web of fear and insecurity that had shaped his life for so long. It wasn't a quick fix, he knew that. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he was committed to doing the work to heal. It wasn't about curing his allergy, about fixing his body's physical limitations. It was about healing his mind, his spirit, and his soul. It was about learning to accept himself, flaws and all. One evening, as David sat in his apartment, reflecting on the journey he had been on, he realized something profound. The world had seen him at his worst. They had seen him vulnerable, exposed, broken. And yet, he was still standing. Not because of his wealth, not because of his success, but because he had allowed himself to be real. In the end, it wasn't about what he could control or how perfect he could appear. It was about how he faced the world with honesty, with integrity, and with a willingness to grow. And that, he realized, was the true definition of strength. Not perfection. Not invulnerability. But the courage to be himself, no matter the cost. David's journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, and more moments of doubt. But he was no longer the man who had hidden behind a mask. He was a man who had faced his own flaws, his own fears, and had emerged stronger because of it. And that was something no allergy, no media frenzy, no personal crisis could ever take away from him. As the years passed and his company continued to grow, David knew that the true legacy he was building wasn't one of financial success or business achievements. It was one of authenticity, resilience, and the power of vulnerability. And that, he realized, was worth far more than any empire could ever be. As the months went by, David's life began to unfold in ways he hadn't anticipated. The whirlwind that had surrounded him in the wake of his public revelation gradually began to settle, but the lessons learned during those intense, transformative weeks remained with him, shaping every decision he made moving forward. He had grown accustomed to the spotlight, but more importantly, he had grown accustomed to a new version of himself, one that was no longer driven by the pursuit of perfection, but by a deep commitment to living authentically and embracing his imperfections. The company, despite the initial panic and media frenzy, was thriving. David's leadership had been tested, but he had passed with flying colors. He had taken what could have been a devastating moment and turned it into a catalyst for change, not just within the walls of his business, but within his own life. His team, who had once followed him blindly because of his brilliance in business, now followed him because they saw in him a leader who was not afraid to show vulnerability, who was not afraid to admit when things weren't perfect. And that had fostered a deeper loyalty, one that went beyond mere professional respect. The shift in the company's culture was palpable. Employees who had previously felt disconnected or intimidated by David's reputation now felt emboldened to speak up, to share their ideas, to contribute in ways they hadn't before. David's willingness to confront his personal struggles had created an environment of openness and transparency that extended beyond the boardroom. It wasn't just about the product or the bottom line anymore. It was about building something greater, something that had purpose beyond profit. Sarah, too, had been a steady anchor in his life. Over time, their relationship had evolved into something deeper than either of them had expected. The walls David had once put up between them had slowly come down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but raw, unfiltered connection. She had seen him at his lowest, had witnessed his darkest moments, and yet she remained unwavering. It was this loyalty, this steadfastness, that had allowed David to continue to open up, to continue to heal, to continue to grow. They began to take walks together, to have long conversations about the future, about what truly mattered to them both. Sarah had always been his partner in life, but now, in the aftermath of everything, she had become his partner in rebuilding. David's newfound approach to life didn't just stop at his company or his relationship with Sarah. It spread into every aspect of his existence. He found himself reaching out to old friends, reconnecting with people he had once pushed away in his obsessive drive for success. One afternoon, as he sat at a cafe with his childhood friend, Marcus, he realized just how far he had come. Marcus had known David long before the wealth, the fame, and the empire. They had grown up together, played sports in the streets, and shared dreams of making it big. But somewhere along the way, David had distanced himself from those who had truly known him. He had been so focused on his vision that he had lost sight of the people who had helped shape him into the man he had become. As they sat and reminisced, David felt a pang of guilt for the years he had spent disconnected from the people who mattered most. But he also felt something else, gratitude. Grateful that Marcus hadn't given up on him, that he was still here, still willing to reconnect. They spent the afternoon talking, laughing, and reflecting on the past. David found himself letting go of old grudges, old wounds, and embracing the idea that relationships were not just about what people could give him, but about what he could give them. He realized that true success wasn't measured in the number of deals closed or the size of his bank account, it was measured in the depth of his relationships and the quality of the connections he had with others. The next few months brought unexpected changes. The media, which had once been relentless in their coverage of David's personal life, began to shift their focus. Instead of the sensationalized headlines about his allergy and his odd condition, the stories began to take a different tone. They no longer saw him as a spectacle, they saw him as a man who had overcome adversity. Stories were written about his leadership style, his transformation as a CEO, and his commitment to building a company culture rooted in vulnerability and authenticity. The narrative around David Knight had changed completely, and for the first time, it felt like the world was finally seeing the real him. David didn't just see these changes as a victory for himself, but as a victory for the people around him. His employees were thriving in ways they hadn't before, and the company was flourishing under his guidance. His investors, who had initially been skeptical of his ability to recover, began to see that his honesty and openness had actually strengthened the company, making it more resilient. His team was now more creative, more motivated, and more invested in the company's mission than ever before. But despite all the progress he had made, David knew that there was still work to be done. He had made great strides in rebuilding his personal life, but he still had a long way to go in terms of fully healing from the emotional scars that his past had left. His allergy, which had once been a source of shame and embarrassment, was now something he managed with care, but it no longer defined him. It was simply a part of his story, not the whole of it. He had come to terms with the fact that no one was perfect, that everyone had their own struggles, their own challenges. What mattered was how you faced those challenges, how you used them to grow, and how you allowed yourself to be vulnerable in the process. In the quiet moments of reflection, David often found himself asking what his legacy would be. What would people remember him for when all was said and done? Would it be his wealth, his business empire, his groundbreaking achievements? Or would it be something deeper, something more meaningful? He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he wanted to leave a legacy of authenticity. A legacy that showed others that it was okay to be imperfect, that it was okay to struggle, and that it was okay to ask for help. One evening, as David sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sunset over the city, he found himself at peace. The world was vast, full of possibilities, but for the first time, he felt grounded in his own skin. He had come to understand that true success wasn't about chasing after an idealized version of himself, it was about accepting who he was and allowing that person to show up every day, no matter what. It was about embracing the challenges, learning from them, and using them to build something real. As he looked out at the horizon, David felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. He had been through the fire, had been tested in ways he never imagined, and had emerged stronger on the other side. He had learned that success wasn't just about what you built, it was about who you became in the process. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, David realized that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he was ready for whatever came next.